Tonight's webinar was requested because some people were confused about the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder and what qualifies one to have post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a lot of talk about it. It's one of the diagnoses that's common in our everyday lexicon. We talk about PTSD often. So I'm going to talk about trauma in general. I'm going to talk about the continuum, and then I'm going to talk about some of the aspects of PTSD, what qualify it to be PTSD. In addition, I'm going to talk about the effects on the brain, what happens, because I think one of the most important things to understand about treating and thinking about trauma is that it's not always a conscious process, right? And what I mean by that is you can't intellectualize yourself out of it. You can't simply talk yourself out of it. Oftentimes, you have to have prolonged experiences that are healing in order to overcome post-traumatic stress disorder. And wilderness therapy, experiential therapy lends itself very, very well to that. PTSD is in part the tortured conscience of good people who did their best under conditions that would dehumanize anyone. So at the extreme end, it is somebody's inability to get over a situation that would dehumanize any of us. And so, again, starting at the outset, I want to talk about this in terms of its compassion. I think when we talk about trauma, one of the things that I've learned is that so often there's actually a structural change in the brain, and that what looks like willful, conscious decision-making, that person doesn't experience it as such. The brain has actually been rewired, hardwired to function in a different way, and oftentimes we're operating from that limbic system, that primitive place where threats are amplified, right? Everything is seen as a threat. And so our decision making is going to be made from that place. And we're going to have a fight or flight or freeze response to even moderately threatening stimuli. There, of course, has to be exposure to a dramatic event. The persistent re-experiencing of that trauma is one of the qualifications that increases it. Persistent avoidance and emotional numbing. The amazing thing about this particular bullet point, folks, and this is important to remember, is that PTSD, of all the diagnoses in the diagnostic manual, has the broadest examples, the broadest criteria of symptoms, right? They're not limited. Anything that can take the person out of that feeling of dread or terror is going to be displayed. So anything from substance abuse to self-harm to dramatically dissociative, not being present in reality of ways of being are going to be a part of that. Persistent symptoms of increased arousal, not presence before. So again, there's that hypervigilance where even the smallest and moderate levels of threat are going to be perceived as incredibly threatening. The duration of the symptoms have to last more than 1 month. There has to be significant impairment. Right? That's really what qualifies everybody for a diagnosis, is if it doesn't inhibit functioning in one of the important spheres of life, social, educational or professional, family relationships, our medical health. If it doesn't affect us in one of those spheres negatively, we don't qualify for the diagnosis. And the DSM-5, published in May of 2013, PTSD is classified as a trauma and stress-related disorder. Let's talk about trauma in general. Start at the beginning. What defines trauma? An event or experience that overwhelms a person's ability to cope or integrate the ideas and emotions involved with that experience, with potential repetitive responses of isolation, hypervigilance, and or self-destructing behaviors as a coping. So fundamental is the person's sense of safety has to be threatened. Interestingly, what can happen in treatment is that we can re-traumatize somebody. If somebody loses the ability, for example, to feel safe or in control of a situation, that experience of losing control, of being overtaken, is common in almost all traumatic events. So even if somebody's coming at it with positive intent to help and to heal, and they take over, it can help somebody to re-experience the trauma. Intensity, duration, what age it happens to you at, how invasive it is, the shame that's associated with it, and of course resiliency factors, and I'll talk about those, all are going to have an impact on the likelihood of somebody developing post-traumatic stress disorder. When we talk about big T and little t, that's a jargon that defines kind of that explicit, obvious, kind of textbook trauma, right? Sexual abuse, participating in a war, being a victim to violence. All of those things are going to be obvious big T traumas. And then, of course, there are little t traumas. Being made fun of at school, right? Being rejected by a girlfriend or boyfriend, your parents yelling at you. You know, all of those things, we might not think of them as big T traumas, but they can have similar effects. When thinking about trauma, it's important, these are some of my ideas, you don't get to define the trauma in someone else's life, they do. I think a lot of people, and I've heard parents for years, struggle with this. They talk about, they have a perspective that says, you know, we provided a pretty safe, pretty normal family life for our child. And they'll go down to list the examples of events that didn't happen in their child's life. So why are they responding this way? And the answer to the question I've given is, you don't get to decide what's upsetting for your child. Somebody else does. That's nobody's right. Somebody I heard define trauma as anything less than ideal. And when we broaden it to that, we can understand that anytime somebody experiences something unwanted, it can have an effect. Of course, the more intense, the more repetitive, the more exposure, the more invasive, all those things that I just listed on the previous page, all of those are going to more likely have an impact. But anything less than ideal can begin to create an unwelcomed experience that we might develop symptoms around in order to cope with. The risk of traumatizing with good abuse. This is from Gill. Thus, if the therapist or guide knows what is right for us and manipulates us to achieve these treatment goals, it is abuse, plain and simple. It is hard to see how good abuse ever cures bad abuse. So that's what we think about. When I have clients, students that are farther along the traumatic end of the spectrum, I oftentimes will be more patient with their progress, right? Let them have more and more of a lead in the treatment planning. I have made mistakes in my career. In fact, I was contacted through social media by a former client over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, where he gave an example. And in fact, I don't recall the example that he gave from my own memory, but he says where I exposed him in a way that felt very threatening and made him feel very vulnerable. And he'd held on to that for years. And of course, I apologized for that and acknowledged that. And I couldn't even imagine myself doing that today. But early on, I thought of this idea. I thought of the idea that I was going to help him. And I knew the way to help him in the process. What are resiliency factors? In fact, this is what my dissertation for my doctoral degree was about what can we do, what's going to mitigate trauma. Family rules and processes in families can mitigate trauma. The more stable it is, oftentimes people that are more susceptible to PTSD have been exposed to chaotic, non-nurturing situations in the home life. So soldiers coming back from war that experience PTSD could at times be separated out by kind of the family of origin, early life experiences. Essentially, the ability to feel, the ability to relate, to resonate to our children is really critical. If our children are allowed to feel, if they are seen, that can have an amazing impact. My research showed, in interviewing over 2,000 young adults during my dissertation, looking at early life experiences and intimacy in young adulthood, that the one most important factor in mitigating against trauma was the question about, did somebody in my life see me? Did I feel connected and supported by at least one person? And if one person consistently in their life was capable of seeing them, containing them, holding them, validating them, listening to them, wasn't anxious or frustrated with them on a consistent basis, wasn't afraid for them on a consistent basis. If that person could be present, grounded, and present with them for a significant portion of time, then these subsequent traumas that we studied had less of an impact on their ability to develop healthy relationships in young adulthood. So that's powerful. You know, I hear so much about questions about resiliency, of somebody having the ability to bounce back, to be unaffected or less affected by trauma or negative experiences. And it is this thing, and that's why we talk about it and spend so much time. That's why it's critical. It's so critical that parents do their own work, because it's only on the foundation of doing our own work, of taking care of ourselves psychologically through whatever means that we find to be most effective. It's only when we build that foundation in ourselves that then we can have the capacity to be there for our child. And since all of us have limited capacity, nobody has all capacity. And because our children require more than average, like I always talk about, it's imperative that we do our own work in the period in this process. So these anchor relationships, basically what I'm describing as healthy attachment. These anchor relationships mitigate the effects of trauma later on in life. How the support system responds to trauma is important. And that's why I think I shared this a couple of weeks ago when I was doing the broadcast on bullying, when I was asked at the end of a long lecture and a long Q&A period about bullying. It wasn't the subject of my presentation that night. But I said in short, and then I expanded on a little bit, do your own work, which didn't make sense at the outset. And what I went on to explain just shortly was, this is a complex process. Parenting, and any one question in parenting is very, very complex. So what we're going to need in order to respond flexibly, supportively to our children is this strong foundation of an earned attachment. We've made sense of our own experiences, our own traumas, our own big T's if we have them, small T's, which we all do, have them so that we can be there for our children. Because if we're responding, right, if we're responding in that primitive way in our brain, the things that our children are going through, if we're responding in a trauma response, then we're not an effective support or container, right? We're exacerbating the trauma. And you know, some of you have children that have threatened to kill themselves, that have overdosed on drugs, that have participated in other dangerous activities, right? That in and of themselves are traumatic for you. So you've got to go out and take care of your own trauma in order to help them with their trauma. And of course, multiple traumas can add to the impact on the individual. Let's talk a little bit of a couple of portions of this about the brain. Trauma or stress causes the brain to produce the neurochemicals cortisol and endorphins regulated by the hypothalamus. When creating these chemicals repeatedly over time, the brain can become addicted to them. This is why addicts or family members in an addicted family are often drawn to drama, intensity, and fear. They cause the brain to generate cortisol and endorphins. In other words, we get that release, right? That good feeling that comes after trauma, and we get addicted to that. We can't be satisfied with kind of a boring, mellow, non-dramatic situation. And since the brain stores information in non-intuitive ways, we need to think about therapy and our response to it in a non-intuitive way. The brain stores memories in clusters called cell assemblies, interconnected and associated events. In other words, you've all had this experience where you smell a certain smell, you hear a certain song, and it brings you back to a certain memory, right? We've all had that. That's because that's how the brain stores information. Memory is in these associated events, not necessarily in the verbal portion of the brain, right? The way that we think of traditional therapy as talk therapy, question and answer, responding, giving advice. Because of the way in which memories are triggered by association and experience odor, texture, sound, or object reminiscent of any part of the memory stored in the cells of the brain can stimulate associated memories. Also, because memories with a high emotional content, pleasant or unpleasant, are more easily recalled by the brain, traumatic memories have a sort of hierarchical power over less emotionally laden ones, right? This is also related to our brain's negative bias, right? We've all had the experience either on the receiving end or the giving end where you could say 10 positive things about somebody or have 10 positive things said about you, and then the one negative thing sticks out, right? That's the only thing we remember or they remember. And that is because in our evolution, it was more important that we responded to, that we paid attention to threats. Think about primitive mammals, like our primitive being. If we missed a predator, for example, if we didn't see a predator, the result was death. If we missed kind of low-hanging fruit, we missed one meal. So our brain has a hierarchy in what it pays attention to. And a predator is much more important. We miss it and we don't live to pass on our DNA. If we miss one piece of low-hanging fruit, which is the positive, then we miss a meal, and that's something to overcome. We take in information through all five senses. Many traumas are pre-verbal experiences that occurred before we learn to express ourselves through speech. It is difficult to reach these wordless places and reflect upon them exclusively through the use of our language. But when our bodies are engaged, we can move through the memory and show what happened rather than try to reconstruct it through words. That is why in both its use as an assessment tool and also as a treatment tool, wilderness therapy can be so effective. In fact, some of the most exciting work that I've ever participated in wasn't the talk therapy session. It was a group experience. It was somebody experience with making something or overcoming something or a difficult hike. It oftentimes was the stuff that happened in between the therapy sessions. A lot of clients will say one of the common suggestions or pieces of feedback is the client say, I want more therapy, more formal therapy is what they're talking about. And in some ways it makes sense because they imagine if they had more therapy, right, 2, 3, 4, 5 formal sessions a week, then the result would be a shorter length of stay. That's their idea. And that's what they're motivated for. But it's the stuff in between that is the work. And therapy is happening all the time. It's just not verbal, formal, traditional talk therapy. So that is why this process can be so effective. The effects, it depends upon, again, the stage of life that we're at. And the stage of life are classically, traditionally listed as early stage of life is about trust. Then we move on to autonomy, industry. I had listed autonomy twice. Identity and intimacy. So depending upon what stage it happens at, it might affect us in one of those areas. PTSD, what is common for the sufferer of PTSD, of course, is an experience of fear or dread or terror, a feeling of powerlessness, where I talked about that idea of choice earlier on, a feeling of helplessness, of horror, right? This is, again, this broad range of symptoms associated with PTSD, cutting eating disorders, substance abuse, far out and crazy behavior that doesn't make any sense, attachment symptoms, inability to connect to other people, to receive connection, oppositional disorders, identity disorders, mimicking the abuse, right? Identifying with the bully or the abuser, to have a sense of, again, of a power, of control of something. Identifying with the perpetrator, lying, exaggerations. That's one of the difficult things about PTSD also and treating trauma, is that oftentimes, even when there is that, there is an exaggeration of the report. And so people find or see that inaccuracy, and then they begin to doubt. But again, it's one of the signs of the disorder. For parents, reading about PTSD, learning about the abuse perhaps that the person suffered, beginning to have empathy, beginning to see, understand how the brain is affected. It reduces judgment. It creates in the parent more compassion and patience. Again, because we so often think of so much of behavior, symptoms, and diagnosis as kind of this willful, conscious process. And it's not. And I think someday, the more we learn about the brain, the more we're going to be able to see its functioning, the more our compassion is going to increase for those that are struggling with symptoms. Because we'll realize that in some ways, they did not have the choice that we projected onto them that they had. For them, it was the only way to survive. Going to support groups. If your child has suffered specific abuse, going to support groups with other parents that have experienced that, to understand the understandable, right? This idea that parents will often say, "I don't get it. I don't understand why they're doing this, why they're displaying this." And the first answer often is it's for a good reason. It might not make sense to you, but somehow it reduces their feeling of dread, of terror, of feeling threatened. Yes, the symptom may itself be creating some of the new problems, but in some way, that's an easier construct to deal with than the original trauma. Try the best we can to treat the issue rather to be distracted by the symptoms. I think that's a core piece of work that I work on constantly in training our therapists and staff, and also our parent education, is do our best not to be distracted by the behaviors. That symptom reduction is often what we think about, and we would be wise to first listen to the symptom and what is it telling us. Because if we just pay attention to the symptom, in part, it serves what it's supposed to serve, which is to distract everybody. Not just the individual suffering with it, but even the people around them, to distract them from the core feeling, from the core wound that is far beneath the symptom. And then trying to find ways to give power back to the client, back to the child, right? Having limits, but understanding that it's a child's process, and that we can hold ideas in our mind about what works, what doesn't work, what's effective, what's ineffective. We can do that, but at the same time, not necessarily share all of that with them all the time. Don't confront the defense head on. It tends to strengthen the defense. For the child, to empower them as much as possible, validate, listen, and understand, of course. To talk about, focus on the relationship. Challenging cognitive distortions on the foundation of what was just said above can be an example. One of my favorite, probably oldest examples of this related to trauma that one of my professors told me in college was he had a client that had been in a severe traumatic car accident and had a terrorizing response to driving going forward. One of the things they did, among other things, is they went to the junkyard where the car that they had crashed in was. And they had an experience around it and with it. And he reframed it as, this car took all of this abuse, took all of this torture, all of the metal bending in order for you to live. So it saved your life, right? Or cognitive distortions like, not all men will hurt you. Some have, for sure, but not all men will hurt you. Sometimes exposure therapy can be a part of it. But most trauma treatments involve telling the story over and over and over again. Some use rapid eye movement techniques. Some use recording devices, but telling the story over and over again, right? So that we don't play out that same battle day to day. It's like the veteran of war walking down the street and a car backfires, right? That we put that battle, that trauma, and where it belongs, which is in our past, in a certain part of our past. Trying to find ways again to have the client drive the therapy, try to give them as much choice as possible. I've found that they can be very effective in moving rather quickly in therapy when they feel like they're given the power. So it's not a passive process, but we do have to exercise some patience. Unshaming, right? This idea that, de-shaming, talking about how some of the things that somebody experienced, for example, sexual abuse, that if we can take the shame out of it. And sometimes people have such a strong reaction to somebody that was sexually abused, for example, that what happens is the client, the individual, takes that on themselves. Even though they didn't choose it, they didn't do it, they were the child. If we're disgusted and repulsed by it, they still have a hard time not taking some of that on themselves. Strength-based, respectful, not fragile, right? Recognizing how they were able to survive, and oftentimes a lot of unhealthy techniques, unhealthy behaviors that are no longer needed because the threat isn't there. A lot of those provided survival for them. Understanding the function of the symptom, right? That even the most irrational symptoms serve their purpose, and to honor them, right? To really honor them is a way. And it's counterintuitive to honor somebody's symptom. We want to shame them, talk them out of it, lecture them out of it, whatever it is. We want to do that because we see it as so harmful and so threatening. And then creating reparative emotional experiences with this new container. And that's really at the core of what therapy is. It's creating a new experience. It's not advice or lecturing, but a new experience. All that other stuff adds to it, but that's the core of it. Alice Miller said in her book on healing from abuse, when we realize all of our lives that we have feared and struggled to ward off something that cannot really happen any longer, it has already happened at the very beginning of our lives when we were completely dependent. She's talking about childhood abuse as a process, but oftentimes we do spend a lot of time in our trauma. And patients with PTSD develop this hypervigilance, this amazing construct of defenses around them to prevent abuse from happening, and it's already happened. What are the take-homes from all of this? Healing is not all about conscious processing. Learning to broaden our definition of trauma to anything less than ideal. Understanding small t traumas, understanding that we don't get to define somebody else's trauma. Remembering often as we can, it's so easy to forget this and lose track of it, that symptoms are the voice of our wounds. And if we can learn that and learn to listen to them, to honor the symptoms, then we can get access to the wounds. Expanding compassion and dampening judgment by understanding that trauma rewires the brain. It excuse me. It tends to get people stuck in this cycle where they're responding in their limbic fight or flight area of the brain rather than their higher functioning of the prefrontal cortex, which is underdeveloped in children at any rate. Understanding that decision making, again, is not all willful. That a person who's experienced trauma has a different brain. I hear people talk about, and this is the old idea about people being chemically imbalanced, right? You hear that. They need medication because they have a chemical imbalance. But sometimes that's created by an event, right? Your brain produces different chemicals, has a different pathway due to events or repeated events. Excuse me. PTSD has many faces. And sometimes, for example, somebody that was sexually abused can become incredibly provocative sexually, can act out sexually, can be very promiscuous sexually, very active. So we might say, well, how could that person possibly have been the victim have PTSD around their sexual abuse isn't even true, people might ask, because look how active they are sexually. But that's how broad it can be. It might not make sense to us, but it still provides a dissociation, right, from some very deep and powerful threats. Experiential therapy is an effective way of assessing and treating trauma because of the way that the brain is structured, because it's not a verbal conscious process. If it's hysterical, it's historical, right? If somebody has and then just think about it as a continuum. If somebody has a dramatic reaction to somebody else, to a certain situation, especially when it is obviously disproportionate to the stimulus, then we know that it's a trauma response. We know that it's related to something in the past. The veteran who hits the deck when a car backfire goes off is an example. Our own reactions to our children are examples. Our children's reactions to us are examples, and so forth and so on. Try our best within limits to give the client a sense of control over the process. Find opportunities to allow them to take the lead. Encouraging, nurturing, being patient. And so I'll take any questions on the topic. First question. Our son was sexually assaulted in aftercare. Subsequent to bringing him home, he has had addiction problems not present prior to wilderness. Do we focus on the addiction or the PTSD? It's really a good question. It's of course hard for me to answer this in a vacuum with just that information. You can do two things at once, right? See, an addict uses when they're happy, when they're sad, when they're scared, when they're bored, when they celebrate. An addict uses all the time. Some people might experiment with use when they're upset or sad or anxious. That can be a different kind of situation. An addict will use no matter what they're feeling. So the question is your child an addict in that sense, right? And will it kill them? Because it may, for addicts, of course, kill them. Or is this one of the symptoms? And so I don't know the answer to that question. So that's the best I can say given this. I would say both. They're both important questions, for sure. Please expand on honoring the symptom. Let's use. What's something that we would find hard to honor? Let's say cutting, right? Most of us intuitively, just responsibly, would try to talk somebody out of cutting, right? We would say that doesn't make sense. It's not helpful. It's not healthy. Honoring is to just simply say, like, it makes sense. I get it. Tell me more about it, and what does it do for you? And gosh, that's going to be hard to give up. Right? I was talking with a parent not too long ago about peer pressure, about an example where somebody participated in something due to peer pressure, and that they were constantly compromised because of peer pressure. And instead of giving them a lecture about peer pressure, you would say to them, it makes sense. I get it. I struggle with what people think about me sometimes. And yeah, I know the desire to fit in. You honor the defense, you honor the symptom, and oftentimes it just lowers all the defenses. In my book, the example that I gave, when my young child said, when we were in a hotel in the morning, I was editing my book, and in the morning, before her and her mother went out to do what they were going to do for the day while I was working, she said, I wish that my siblings were dead, my 3 older siblings. And of course, since I was writing the book, I was sharp, and so I said, wouldn't that be great if you were an only child? We'd get to be able to do this all the time. You'd have all this attention. Most of us would think to say, it's not good to think about your siblings being dead, or let's talk about all the positives. And when I honored the statement, she came back with, yeah, but I'd miss them. And my big sister is my best friend. And she came up with all these positives because I honored the defense. I honored the symptom, if you will. So that's what it means. All right, no other questions right now. I'll go with upcoming events, and then we'll go to any other questions at the end. We would like all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, specifically Al-Anon, CODA, or Families Anonymous. You can also go to NAMI.org to learn more about education, meetings, support groups in your area that are free or affordable. If you would like to watch or listen to any of these broadcasts on podcasts, you can, and these are available to anybody. Go to your iOS device, your iPhone, and go to the podcast app and search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there. If you have an Android device, download the SoundCloud app and search Evoke Therapy Programs there. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram for upcoming announcements, inspirational pictures, stories, articles. On Facebook, you search us at Evoke Therapy Programs. And if you go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook, it's an organization that we support that raises money to help people who can't afford therapy. And then, of course, going to our Evoke Therapy blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. Go to other purchasing options right now because the reprint for the warehouse, for the main warehouse, is still happening. So go to other options, other buying options, and buy it from the Enlightening Relationship, which is ours. You'll get a new copy from there, or you can listen to it. You can read it on Kindle or get an audio version of it. The Parent Alumni Foundation book page has recommendations from our therapists for various topics. If you buy the book through the Amazon Smiles program, a percentage of the proceeds goes to charity to people who can't afford it, can't afford therapy. The next workshop, we want all current parents, if at all possible, to go to a workshop. The next one is October 21st through 22nd. And then after that, November 18th through 19th. You can combine that with a field visit. If your therapist says that the timing is right, contact Gail at evoketherapy.com for more information or to RSVP. Potentially one spot left. If you're interested, there's perhaps one spot left in the intensive next week. It might have been filled, but email Andrea at evoketherapy or .com this evening if you're at all interested. It's next week in Park City. And then there's actually some spots already filling up for the November Finding You Intensive. This is deeper work. These are the ones that I'll be running, where we take 6 clients and we go into your family of origin, meditation, mindfulness, some of your own historical work, and like I said, make sense out of it, and how does it show up in your relationships today. We also have the opportunity for private family intensives. Email intensives@evoketherapy.com for questions. I'm having a cough tonight. Excuse me. I'm sorry. The parent support groups we have on the calendar. We will be in Washington, D.C. this week, Thursday night, at the Residence Inn, Pentagon City, 7 to 9 p.m. In New York City on October 29th. That's a Sunday afternoon. And then in Chicago, we haven't nailed down the date yet. It's the week of November 13th. Email Andrea at evoketherapy.com for more information or questions, or to RSVP. Pursuits trips are international and adventure trips for adults, young adults, and families. Sober fun, therapy light with an adventure component. Should we as parents express our regret that we didn't protect our child from, for instance, sexual abuse? Should we do this even if we were not in a position to protect the child? That's a fantastic question. I think so. I mean, what you're saying is, I wish I could have, and I'm sorry I didn't. And even if it would have been nearly impossible, that can be very validating. It also gives an opportunity for them to express anger in that area that may be there. All right. The book, Why Won't You Apologize, by Harriet Lerner, that I did a webinar on, broadcast on a few weeks back, she gives an example of just that, of a parent acknowledging that they didn't know about, but weren't able to protect them, didn't see it. I think that's a very generous gift that we give our children, even if rationally there might not have been any realistic way to stop it. I think that's a fantastic, wonderful gift, and lets them know that you're safe to talk to be angry at. They need somebody to be angry at. And you allowing them for it to be you is a great, great gift. Our daughter was sexually assaulted on 2 separate occasions, and after that started acting in anger and was very promiscuous. We've come to learn that in her letter of accountability. She is now in a residential treatment center dealing with the trauma. I'm wondering if you recommend EMDR for dealing with this when she comes home. I will say this. EMDR has been proven in the literature to have a positive effect on it. My answer is yes. I would try it. I would offer it. I would suggest it. There are many people, in fact, in the book I just mentioned by Harriet Lerner, she gives an example where somebody was in traditional psychotherapy for many years and went to EMDR, and it did have a dramatic effect, an improvement effect on the individual. So yes, it's not, again, it's not necessarily a rational process that we would intuitively go towards, but the research shows that it's common. And again, I will say, of all of the treatments that are available, that are known to be in the research effective, the common thread is telling the story over and over, almost ad nauseum. Telling the story over and over again. EMDR does that with the eye movement. So my answer would be yes. I would strongly consider that and offer that. Can PTSD be overcome? Of course, absolutely. In fact, wilderness therapy is now used by the Veterans Association, right? Veterans coming back from war oftentimes are using wilderness therapy. We've even talked about the possibility of creating one just for veterans. It would be hard, I think, to maintain the structure of it unless we had a contract with somebody, but it can be overcome. Experiential therapy, exposure therapy, EMDR, other therapies that talk about how to treat it, they can be effective. And having a reparative experience, a safe experience. And oftentimes it's going to be a theme, right? It's going to be a theme. And we're all on the trauma continuum. Hopefully, we're closer to the end of little trauma. Nobody has no trauma. They might just have small t trauma, and they might be very resilient. But all of us have had moments where we have felt unsafe and threatened. And we all have moments at times where we overreact to things. Overreact is not a great term because it's not really overreacting when you consider the history. But just thinking about it in a simplistic way, how many of you have overreacted to something? That's evidence of a trauma response. But the answer to the question is absolutely. Is the play going to also be in Nashville, October 20th and 21st? Yes, it is. Is that right? Andrew, I'll look on the calendar here. I just want to make sure before I answer that question. I believe it is. It will be, I have it on the 21st. Yeah, the 21st at the Oz Arts in Nashville, Tennessee. So go to the On Guard Arts, ENGARD arts.org website to find out where the play will be showing. Right now, those are the only 2 ones on the calendar. We've had a very difficult time getting funding. It's a nonprofit theater company, and they're just looking to break even. That's all they want to do. It's a passion project, a heart project, but we've had virtually no success from any other therapeutic program in the country at getting any kind of support for it. And although many people have expressed the desire, it really will take benefactors and donors to do it. And so that's just the way that it is. We'd love for it to be out there. There's also a Facebook page on Wilderness, the Wilderness play also, if you want to go there. Can parents experience PTSD symptoms for witnessing the going through the behaviors that their child are suffering? For example, suicide attempts, anxiety. Do those traumatized parents? I feel like they do. Absolutely. I think it's probably one of the most underemphasized aspects of this is that most of the parents that I deal with have trauma. And they're dealing with a child with trauma in a trauma response kind of way. And that doesn't help anybody, right? It doesn't help anybody, but absolutely. And that's why doing your work, that's what I said, doing your work is so critical so that you can be more capable of containing, of holding a child. And somebody that's operating from a trauma, unresolved trauma base is not going to be most effective at supporting somebody else. Because fears, symptoms, problems, right? We go to the worst possible outcome. It terrifies us. It upsets us. We become reactive, controlling, rigid, hypervigilant, all those things. And now we're starting to describe somebody with PTSD symptoms. Absolutely. All right, folks, thank you so much for your participation tonight and for your energy. And we had a great group and several of you on tonight. And so I appreciate that. And again, consider the fact that in the mental health field, in the mental health perspective, mental health is not a black and white kind of thing. Yes, you have to meet certain criteria to have a diagnosis, but we all are on the continuum somewhere. And all of us struggle with something. And the more we see that common thread, that similarity, even with our children who are struggling on the more severe end, the more helpful, connected, and healing we can be for each other. So thank you. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you on Wednesday night. We'll have the next broadcast Wednesday night, and we'll announce it tomorrow. We'll send out the announcement tomorrow for the topic and time. Take care, folks. Bye-bye.